Imagine watching the world's greatest superpower crumble to dust in less than a lifetime. For 3 centuries, Britain ruled a quarter of the planet's surface and governed 400 million souls. The sun never set on territory stretching from frozen Canadian shores to scorching Australian deserts. Yet within 50 years, this seemingly invincible empire dissolved like salt in water. Tonight, you'll discover the ruthless ambition, staggering genius, and fatal arrogance that built history's mightiest empire, and the unstoppable forces that tore it apart. This is the story of how a rain-soaked island conquered the world, and why it couldn't hold on. Britain's imperial destiny emerged from an unlikely source, the cold grey seas that imprisoned it. In the early 1600s, this fractured archipelago, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, was nobody's idea of a future superpower. These kingdoms fought each other more than foreign enemies, sold wool to Dutch merchants, and watched continental wars burn from a safe distance across the Channel. But 1588 changed everything. When Spain's Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel like a floating city of conquest, it seemed unstoppable. Spain controlled the Americas, the world's silver mines, and Catholic Europe's military might. The English had something unexpected, desperation fused with innovation. Their ships were smaller, faster, more agile. Their captains were pirates turned patriots, men like Francis Drake who'd learned warfare by stealing Spanish treasure. The battle revealed a fundamental shift in warfare philosophy. Spanish commanders fought like medieval knights, seeking to board enemy vessels for hand-to-hand combat. The English fought like merchants, maintaining distance while their cannon systematically destroyed the enemy. It was honor versus efficiency, chivalry versus modernity. When storms scattered the Spanish fleet, the English claimed divine intervention. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was the first sign that the future belonged not to the largest armies, but to the most adaptable minds. The Armada's defeat triggered a psychological transformation. For the first time, the English saw themselves as potential maritime masters rather than peripheral Europeans. Queen Elizabeth I understood this shift instinctively, encouraging privateers to raid Spanish treasure ships. Men like Drake and Walter Raleigh became national heroes, returning with Spanish gold and tales of distant lands ripe for conquest. But the true revolution came with joint stock companies, something genuinely new in human history. These were private corporations with governmental powers, the right to wage war, sign treaties, govern territories. They were capitalism armed with cannons, commerce backed by conquest. The Muscovy Company opened trade through frozen Arctic seas with Russia. The Levant Company brought silk and spices from the Ottoman Empire. And in 1600, the most consequential of all received its charter, the East India Company. The company's motto was simple: trade follows the flag. In practice, the flag followed trade. Its first voyage to India in 1601, for ships carrying English wool, hoping to return with spices, marked the beginning of a relationship that would transform both nations, making one the world's master and reducing the other to colonial subjugation. Meanwhile, English colonists established desperate footholds in the New World. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was a disaster where most colonists died of disease and starvation. It survived by the thinnest margins, sustained by tobacco cultivation and the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. The Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were fleeing persecution, not seeking empire. Yet they carried something more powerful than armies: English language, English law, and English ideas about property, government, and individual rights. By 1650, England had established struggling colonies in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Barbados, and Jamaica. These weren't yet imperial jewels, they were settlements constantly threatened by disease, starvation, and hostile neighbors. But they represented something unprecedented: systematic colonization of distant lands, not merely to extract wealth, but to recreate England itself in foreign soil. This difference proved crucial. Spanish colonies existed primarily to enrich Spain, remaining dependent on the mother country. English colonies developed their own economies, institutions, and identities. They became extensions of England, not merely possessions. The English also proved more adaptable than rivals. Where Spain imposed culture and religion on conquered peoples, England was pragmatic. They worked with local rulers, adopted local customs when convenient, governed indirectly through existing power structures. This pragmatism was born of necessity. England lacked resources for direct rule over vast territories, but it became a source of strength, allowing control of far larger areas with far fewer soldiers. By the century's end, the foundations were set. The Royal Navy was becoming the world's most powerful fleet. English merchants traded in every ocean. Colonists spread across North America and the Caribbean. The East India Company was beginning its conquest of India. The stage was set for history's greatest expansion. But first, Britain had to become Britain. The union that built an empire. In 1707, something remarkable happened. Two ancient enemies, England and Scotland, decided to become one nation. The Act of Union created Great Britain and with it, the political foundation for the greatest empire ever known. But this wasn't a love story, it was a business transaction negotiated in smoke-filled rooms by men who understood that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Scotland, bankrupted by a disastrous attempt to establish its own colony in Panama, needed English money. England, facing the prospect of a hostile Scotland allied with France, needed Scottish loyalty. Scottish nobles were bribed with English gold. English politicians were promised Scottish support. The common people were largely ignored. Yet from this cynical beginning emerged something extraordinary. The Union created a new kind of nation, simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, conservative and revolutionary. It could draw on England's commercial genius and Scotland's intellectual brilliance, the South's naval traditions and the North's military prowess. The Scots, who had been England's enemies for centuries, became the empire's most enthusiastic builders. Scottish engineers built the roads and bridges connecting the empire. Scottish doctors and teachers spread across colonies, bringing education and medicine to the farthest corners. Scottish soldiers fought in every imperial war, their kilts and bagpipes becoming symbols of British power from the Highlands to the Himalayas. But the Union also created something darker, a sense of racial and cultural superiority that would justify centuries of exploitation. The British began seeing themselves as inherently superior, Protestant in a Catholic world, civilized among barbarians, free among slaves. This superiority was reinforced by the Enlightenment sweeping through 18th-century Britain. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume, and Edmund Burke developed theories that seemed to explain British success and justify British expansion. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, 1776, argued that free trade and competition naturally led to prosperity and progress. This became the intellectual foundation for British economic imperialism, the idea that opening global markets to British goods was not just profitable but morally beneficial to all mankind. Edmund Burke's writings provided philosophical justification for British rule over backward peoples. The British, Burke argued, had a duty to govern those incapable of governing themselves, to bring civilization to the uncivilized, to impose order on chaos. These weren't just academic theories, they became operating principles. Every conquest was justified as a civilizing mission. Every exploitation rationalized as economic development. Every oppression explained as necessary discipline. But the real engine of British expansion wasn't philosophy. It was war. The 18th century was an age of almost constant warfare as European powers fought for dominance across continents. In these wars, Britain discovered its greatest advantage, the ability to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously while landlocked enemies remained trapped. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was history's first truly global conflict, fought on 3 continents and every ocean, from North American forests to Indian plains, Caribbean islands to African coasts. In North America, British and colonial forces captured Quebec and Montreal, ending French rule in Canada. General James Wolfe's death on the Plains of Abraham became legend, a young hero dying in victory's moment, reportedly saying, now God be praised, I will die in peace. In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey, 1757, gave the East India Company control of Bengal, the subcontinent's richest province. It was won not by superior tactics but superior corruption. Clive had bribed enemy generals to switch sides at the crucial moment. In the Caribbean, British forces captured French sugar islands. In Africa, British traders established new posts feeding the growing demand for enslaved labor in American colonies. The Peace of Paris, 1763, marked Britain's emergence as the world's dominant power. France ceded Canada and all North American territories east of the Mississippi. Spain, allied with France, gave up Florida. Britain now controlled eastern North America and was India's undisputed master. But victory came with a fatal price. The war cost Britain £140 million, more than the government's entire annual revenue. National debt doubled. Parliament desperately sought new revenue sources. The obvious solution: tax the American colonies that had benefited from British protection. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay tax on all printed materials. It seemed reasonable to British politicians. Colonists should pay for their own defense. The colonists saw it differently. They had no representation in Parliament, so how could Parliament tax them? No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. What began as a tax dispute escalated into constitutional crisis, then armed rebellion, finally into a war for independence that would tear the empire apart. India, the jewel in the crown. Of all territories flying the Union Jack, none was more important to the British imagination than India. It was the jewel in the crown, the source of Britain's wealth and power, proof of its civilizing mission. But India was also the empire's greatest contradiction, a land of ancient wisdom ruled by foreign merchants, a civilization older than Britain itself reduced to colonial subjugation. The transformation from trading partner to imperial possession was gradual, almost accidental. The East India Company came to trade, not conquer. But in a land where political authority was fragmenting, where local rulers fought endless wars, the company found that military power was necessary to protect commercial interests. Each victory led to new responsibilities, new territories, new peoples to control. The company's private army grew from a few hundred soldiers to over 200,000 men. Its territories expanded from coastal trading posts to vast provinces containing millions. By 1850, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent either directly or through puppet princes. It was a government masquerading as a business, an empire disguised as a corporation. Shareholders in London received dividends from taxes paid by Indian peasants. Company officials in India grew rich from corruption and private trade. But this system contained its own destruction. Company rule was extractive and exploitative, designed to maximize shareholder revenue rather than promote subject welfare. Taxes were crushing, forcing peasants to grow cash crops for export rather than food for local consumption. Traditional industries were destroyed by competition from British manufactured goods. Famines became more frequent and deadly as old grain storage systems were dismantled. The company also interfered with Indian religious and social customs, creating deep resentment. British officials, convinced of their moral superiority, tried to reform barbaric practices. They banned suttee, widow burning, suppressed thuggee, ritual murder by criminal gangs, built roads and railways cutting across sacred sites. These reforms were often genuinely humanitarian but imposed without consultation or consent. To many Indians, they seemed like attacks on religion and culture, evidence that the British intended to convert them all to Christianity and destroy their ancient way of life. The introduction of the Enfield rifle in 1857 provided the spark. New rifle cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. When Indian soldiers were ordered to bite cartridges to load rifles, many refused. What began as military mutiny quickly became general uprising against British rule. Rebels proclaimed restoration of the Mughal Empire and called for expulsion of all foreigners. For over a year, much of northern India was in revolt. British women and children were massacred at Kanpur. The siege of Delhi lasted months. Lucknow's siege became an epic of imperial heroism and horror. The British response was savage beyond belief. Entire villages suspected of supporting rebellion were burned. Rebels were blown from cannons or hanged from trees. The retribution shocked even some British observers. But the rebellion also revealed British rule's strength. Most Indian soldiers remained loyal. Princely states with British treaties mostly stayed neutral or actively supported the British. The rebellion was confined to northern India, the south and west remained quiet. When finally crushed, the British government decided the East India Company could no longer be trusted. The Government of India Act, 1858, transferred control from company to crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the subcontinent became the jewel in the imperial crown. The new Raj was more centralized and efficient than company rule, but also more distant and authoritarian. The Indian civil service provided professional administration but was almost entirely British. Indians were excluded from senior positions in their own government. The Indian Army was reorganized with more British officers, fewer Indian soldiers. Railways expanded rapidly, providing economic development and military control. Most importantly, the Raj created a new class of educated Indians who understood both Western ideas and Indian grievances. Universities established by the British produced lawyers, doctors, teachers, journalists who could articulate Indian nationalism in terms the British themselves had taught them. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially sought only modest reforms. Early leaders were moderate men believing gradual progress was possible. They petitioned for more Indian representation in government, more Indian officers in the army, protection of Indian industries from British competition. But the British response was largely negative. The Raj wasn't interested in sharing power, even with educated Indians who had adopted British values. Lord Curzon, Viceroy from 1899 to 1905, summed up the attitude: "The Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to a peaceful demise." This attitude was self-defeating. By refusing to accommodate moderate Indian nationalism, the British ensured it would become radical. By treating all Indians as subjects rather than citizens, they created a common identity among peoples who had previously seen themselves as Bengalis, Marathas, or Tamils rather than Indians. By the 1870s, Britain faced a terrifying new reality: competition. For most of the 19th century, Britain had enjoyed what historians call the imperialism of free trade, the ability to dominate global markets through superior industrial capacity and naval power without the expense of formal colonization. But now other European powers were catching up. Germany, unified in 1871, was rapidly industrializing and building a powerful navy. France, recovered from Franco-Prussian War humiliation, sought to restore prestige through colonial expansion. Russia pushed south toward India and east toward the Pacific. Even Belgium was carving out colonial empire. The result was the scramble for Africa, the most rapid and complete colonization of a continent in human history. In 1870, Europeans controlled only 10% of Africa. By 1900, they controlled 90%. Britain's strategy was to secure the most valuable territories before competitors could claim them. Cape Colony controlled the sea route to India. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, the shortcut to the east. Nigeria controlled the palm oil trade. Kenya controlled the Nile headwaters. Each territory was a piece in a global puzzle, valuable not just for its own resources but for its strategic position. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate who dreamed of building a railway from Cape Town to Cairo, embodied this new aggressive imperialism. Rhodes believed British expansion was not just profitable but morally necessary, that the Anglo-Saxon race had a duty to civilize the world, and more territory under British rule meant more happiness for humanity. The Berlin Conference, 1884–1885, attempted to regulate Africa's partition, but was really just a way for European powers to divide the continent without fighting each other. The conference established the principle of effective occupation, European claims had to be backed by actual administration and control. This led to a race to establish trading posts, sign treaties with local chiefs, and plant flags in remote corners. The Africans themselves weren't consulted. They were simply obstacles to be overcome or allies to be bought. The human cost was enormous. King Leopold's Congo Free State became a byword for colonial brutality, using forced labor to extract rubber and ivory, killing millions of Congolese. German suppression of the Herero and Nama peoples in southwest Africa was genocide, wiping out entire ethnic groups. Britain's record wasn't much better. Sudan's conquest involved systematic destruction of the Mahdiist state and massacre of defenders at Omdurman, 1898. Winston Churchill, who participated as a young cavalry officer, described it as the most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. The Zulu War, 1879, saw British forces suffer devastating defeat at Isandlwana before crushing Zulu resistance at Ulundi. The war's real purpose was destroying the last independent African kingdom in southern Africa. Most challenging were the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-speaking farmers who'd been in South Africa for 2 centuries, had established independent republics. When gold was discovered in the Transvaal, 1886, British interest intensified dramatically. The Second Boer War, 1899–1902, was Britain's most difficult colonial conflict. Boers fighting on home territory with superior terrain knowledge proved formidable opponents, using guerrilla tactics that frustrated conventional warfare. The British response was scorched earth, burning Boer farms and herding civilians into concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, mostly from disease and malnutrition. It was a preview of 20th-century total warfare. The war cost Britain £200 million and required 450,000 troops to defeat 60,000 Boer fighters. It was a Pyrrhic victory that damaged Britain's international reputation and revealed imperial power's limits. The Industrial Revolution, workshop of the world. By the mid-19th century, Britain had become something unprecedented, a nation that could manufacture goods faster and cheaper than any competitor, then use naval supremacy to force open markets worldwide. The smoking chimneys of Manchester and Birmingham became engines of empire, producing wealth that paid for armies and navies conquering the globe. Steam was the driving force. Steam engines pumped water from coal mines, allowing deeper excavation. Steam-powered textile mills produced cloth faster than armies of hand weavers. Steam locomotives carried goods at unprecedented speed. Steam-powered ships freed Britain from wind and weather, allowing year-round global navigation. The statistics were staggering. By 1850, Britain produced half the world's iron and 2/3 of its coal. British factories turned out more cotton cloth than the rest of the world combined. British shipyards built more vessels than all other nations together. But this supremacy came at terrible human cost. New factory towns were hellholes of pollution, overcrowding, and disease. Workers labored 14 hours daily in conditions that would have shocked medieval serfs. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, their small fingers perfect for tying broken threads. Friedrich Engels described Manchester's working-class districts as a hell upon earth. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes. Streets were open sewers. Entire families lived in single windowless rooms. Life expectancy in industrial cities was half that of the countryside. Yet this exploitation system was also liberation. Factory workers, however miserable, were free in ways peasants never were. They could leave jobs, move to other cities, organize unions, demand better wages. The industrial system created not just wealth but the working class that would eventually challenge capitalist society's entire structure. Wealth generated by British industry flowed outward through the empire like blood through arteries. Raw materials flowed in, cotton from India and America, wool from Australia, timber from Canada, sugar from the Caribbean. These were processed in British factories and sold back to colonies as finished goods at enormous profit. This imperial trade system was enforced by the Royal Navy, which had become history's most powerful fleet. British warships patrolled every ocean, protecting British merchants and intimidating potential competitors. The Opium Wars with China perfectly illustrated this system. The Chinese Empire had little interest in British manufactured goods. Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain that Europeans craved but saw no need for European products in return, creating a trade imbalance draining British silver reserves. But British merchants found one product Chinese consumers craved: opium grown in British-controlled India. The drug trade was incredibly profitable. Opium cost almost nothing to produce but sold for enormous sums. When the Chinese government tried banning opium imports to protect its people from addiction, Britain went to war to defend the drug trade. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, ended with China forced to cede Hong Kong and open 5 ports to British trade. The second, 1856 to 1860, forced China to legalize opium imports and open more ports. It was imperialism at its most cynical, using military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept trade destroying its people. But from the British perspective, it was simply business. Free trade was a moral good, and anyone opposing it stood in the way of progress and civilization. When August 1914's guns began thundering across Europe, few understood they were witnessing the beginning of the British Empire's end. The Great War would test the Empire's strength as nothing had before, revealing both remarkable resilience and fatal weaknesses. At first, the war seemed to demonstrate imperial unity and power. From every corner, British subjects rallied to the flag. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa declared war on Germany within days. India contributed over 1 million soldiers. Even the smallest colonies sent what they could. Young men from Saskatchewan wheat fields and New South Wales sheep stations marched to French and Belgian trenches. Indian regiments served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa. South African forces conquered German Southwest Africa. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in one of the war's most famous and tragic campaigns. But this global mobilization came at a price that would prove fatal. The war cost Britain over £37 billion, more than the entire national wealth at the conflict's start. National debt increased over 1,000%. Britain, the world's creditor, became the world's debtor, owing enormous sums to the United States. More importantly, the war shattered the myth of European superiority central to imperial ideology. The civilized nations of Europe had torn each other apart with savagery that shocked the world. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery barrages turned the Western Front into a charnel house where millions died for gains measured in yards. Colonial subjects who'd been told they were fighting for civilization and democracy saw European civilization destroying itself. Indian soldiers in France wrote home about witnessed horrors. African porters carrying supplies in East Africa saw white men killing each other with industrial efficiency. The white race's moral authority, already questionable, was further undermined by European self-destruction spectacle. The war also accelerated political changes building for decades. India's contribution created expectations of political reform the British were reluctant to fulfill. The Government of India Act, 1919, gave Indians limited roles in provincial government but fell far short of the self-government many expected as reward for loyalty. The Rowlatt Acts, 1919, giving the government emergency powers to arrest and detain Indians without trial, seemed to prove British reform promises were worthless. The response was Mahatma Gandhi's emergence as Indian nationalism's leader with his revolutionary doctrine of nonviolent resistance. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, April 13, 1919, marked a turning point. General Reginald Dyer ordered troops to fire on an unarmed crowd in a Waldom-Ritzer garden, killing at least 379 and wounding over 1,000. Dyer's action was defended by many British officials as necessary to maintain order, but it shocked Indian opinion and destroyed whatever remained of Indian faith in British justice. The massacre revealed the ugly reality behind imperial benevolence rhetoric. When faced with authority challenges, the British were prepared to use overwhelming force without mercy or discrimination. The civilizing mission was revealed as thin veneer over military rule's iron fist. The Second World War was the British Empire's last great victory and its final defeat. When guns fell silent in August 1945, Britain stood among victors, its flag still flying over vast territories, prestige apparently intact. But the war had drained the Empire's lifeblood, leaving a hollow shell that would crumble within a generation. Britain had spent over £28 billion, more than the entire national wealth in 1939. National debt tripled. Gold reserves were gone, spent on American weapons and supplies. Britain, which entered as a creditor nation, emerged as the world's largest debtor. Over 450,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen died. Entire cities were reduced to rubble by German bombing. The merchant marine lost over 30,000 men and 4,000 ships. But the real damage was psychological. The war shattered the myth of British invincibility central to imperial rule. Singapore's fall, Burma's retreat, the Middle Eastern positions near collapse, all showed the British weren't the invincible race they'd claimed to be. Colonial subjects who'd fought for freedom and democracy took those words seriously. Indian soldiers who fought in Burma and Italy returned with new ideas about their rights and capabilities. African soldiers who served in the Middle East and Far East came back with broader understanding of the world and their place in it. The Labour Party's 1945 victory brought to power men skeptical of empire and committed to domestic social reform. Clement Attlee, the new Prime Minister, had long believed the empire was an expensive anachronism diverting resources from domestic priorities. The new government faced an impossible choice: maintain the empire or rebuild Britain. The country lacked resources for both. India was the first and most important domino. The Indian National Congress and Muslim League had both supported the war effort on the understanding that independence would follow victory. When war ended, they weren't prepared to wait longer. Partition became inevitable despite its terrible human cost. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was given the impossible task of transferring power while maintaining order. India's partition in August 1947 was accompanied by communal violence, killing over 1 million and displacing 12 million more. It was a tragic end to the jewel in the crown, but also recognition that the age of empire was over. India's loss was followed by a cascade of independence movements. Burma became independent in January 1948, followed by Ceylon in February. Palestine, ungovernable due to Jewish-Arab conflict, was handed to the United Nations in May 1948. The pattern repeated across Africa and Asia. Ghana became independent in 1957, followed by Nigeria, 1960, Kenya, 1963, and dozens of others in following decades. By the 1970s, the British Empire had been reduced to a handful of small islands and territories too small or remote for viable independence. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was perhaps the most humiliating moment. When President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched military intervention to regain control. The operation was a military success but political disaster. The United States and Soviet Union both condemned the intervention, and Britain was forced to withdraw in humiliation. Suez showed Britain could no longer act as a great power without American support. That a special relationship with the United States became a relationship of dependence rather than partnership. Today, walking through London streets, you can still see Empire's ghosts everywhere. The Grand Whitehall buildings where the Colonial Office once governed a quarter of the world. Monuments to imperial heroes in Trafalgar and Parliament Squares. Museums filled with treasures looted from every corner of the globe. But the empire itself is gone, as vanished as Roman legions or Mongol hordes. The pink has faded from the map, replaced by independent nations' flags. The Royal Navy that once ruled the waves is reduced to a handful of ships. The country that once governed 400 million now struggles to govern 67 million. Yet the legacy lives on. English language, spread by imperial conquest and commerce, has become the global lingua franca. Legal systems of dozens of countries are based on English common law. Parliamentary democracy pioneered at Westminster has been adopted worldwide. The economic system created by empire, global capitalism based on free trade and capital movement, has become humanity's dominant model. But the legacy isn't entirely positive. Arbitrary borders drawn by imperial administrators became sources of conflict from the Middle East to Africa. Racial hierarchies created to justify imperial rule left deep scars on societies worldwide. Economic exploitation that enriched Britain impoverished many former colonies, creating underdevelopment patterns persisting today. Perhaps most importantly, the British Empire established the template for modern globalization, the integration of world economy, movement of people and ideas across boundaries, creation of international institutions. All have roots in the imperial system Britain created. But the empire also demonstrated power's limits and change's inevitability. No matter how dominant an empire becomes, no matter how permanent it seems, it carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Success breeds complacency, expansion creates overstretch, and the very forces that create empire eventually turn against it. The British learned this lesson the hard way. Their empire collapsed not from single catastrophic defeat but from gradual erosion of power's foundations. Economic decline, military overstretch, nationalist resistance, and changing global conditions combined to make empire unsustainable. The age of empire is over. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but it has risen on a new world the empire helped create. Power is temporary, but the human story continues. The British Empire conquered the world, but the world, in the end, conquered the British Empire. And in that conquest perhaps lies the seed of a better future for all humanity, a future built not on domination, but on the hard-won understanding that all empires, no matter how mighty, eventually fall.